It's my absolute pleasure today to welcome Marci Shore, who is currently working at the Munk School of Global Affairs. Previously of Yale University, she specializes in history of literary and political engagement with Marxism and phenomenology. Marci is author of Caviar and Ashes, a Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism, 1918 to 1968, and The Taste of Ashes, a study of the presence of the Communist Nazi Party in today's Eastern Europe. But today we will be discussing a number of topics. We'll focus on the US and the authoritarian slide, and we will also focus on what's happening in Ukraine, especially stimulated by a couple of events I recently attended and various discussions about the normalization of politics in abnormal times and what the danger of that tendency is. Marci, welcome back to the channel.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me back, Jonathan.
Well, we've got, as always, it's dark topics, and yes, there's very little light here, except that Ukraine fights on. I mean, I think we last spoke 6 months ago. Um, we have Pokrovsk, which is about to fall, but it's taken 21 months. It may well take 22 before it finally goes. And what Russia inherits is really, unfortunately, a pile of ashes and rubble. It was people's homes, but there's no real strategic victory here. And I just want to get your thoughts of where we are with that, because of course, this is a very long and an arduous struggle. And sometimes I think we take, um, Ukrainians, not commitment for granted, but their ability to just keep fighting forever.
It's absolutely brutal, and I don't know how they continue to do it. No human being can be pushed indefinitely. Everybody has a breaking point. Although I have met Ukrainians who have just been through extraordinary things, and the fact that they are still psychically and physically intact, I can only be in awe of. But the idea that you can send people out to, be slaughtered, to see their kids buried under rubble, to stay in the trenches, to deal with violence, to mobilize themselves, to engage in violence in their own self-defense, um, they're human beings. I mean, we have to think about what we can expect from human beings.
And of course, they're not infinite. I mean, Russia tends to treat people as resources, but Ukraine treats its people as people. But they are a finite resource, especially the people that are choosing to go and fight in Ukraine. I mean, it's a cliche, but Ukraine is sending its best. Russia, not so much.
No, I mean, in some ways, this is the huge advantage that Russia has is that they have a government that doesn't care about their people. Putin will bleed through his entire population like he will happily burn through his country's entire resources until he's defeated. They don't care how many people they lose. I mean, they keep sending out people like cannon fodder, and if you don't care about other people's lives, that gives you an incredible advantage. And then you have a free hand. Then there are no constraints. So the Ukrainians are losing, many fewer people relative to the Russians, but they care about the ones they're losing. I mean, it doesn't mean it's few. Um, no, I spoke to, I have a friend who I wrote about this in the New York Review of Books, who, among the work he's done in the military, has been to, what would the word be, eavesdrop on Russian communications in the military, and he learned a lot, from that, about the culture of fighting there. He said, the commander, calls someone and says, Ivan, you go, and Ivan's like, I'm not Ivan. Ivan is dead. Okay, Andrei, you go. I'm not Andrei. Andrei's dead. Like, okay, Mitya, you go. Like, and the commander just doesn't care. Um, and then my friend is asking, well, and then the question is, why do people continue obeying orders knowing they're about to get killed and knowing their lives are not being valued? Um, which is another question. But, there's a population that has been crushed in some way, that has no sense of their own selfhood, and at what point, what would it take to get a revolution in Russia? What would it take to end that situation?
That's the
Um,
great unanswered question as well, isn't it? I listened to an awful lot of the interviews with Zulkin and Apostol of captured Russian
mm,
POWs. And that also is an extraordinary insight. I mean, despite what many people think, I mean, many of them will just cite the money that's being paid to go and fight. Some of them might have some kind of conception. That conception is usually in very cliched phrases and sort of propagandistic, mythologized versions of history. But it's surprising how few of them cite any kind of ideological or even identity
Mhm.
reasons for doing this.
No, I've been thinking a lot actually about this idea of nihilism, and the role that nihilism is playing in this 21st century. We can call it some kind of postmodern neo-fascism or postmodern authoritarianism or whatever label we give to it. Because I've been thinking a lot as a historian about the continuities from the kinds of tyrannical regimes and totalitarian regimes we saw in the 20th century, and the discontinuities. I mean, I've also been thinking about the relationship between Russian nihilism, of the mid 19th century, what Dostoevsky describes in Demons, and what we're seeing now, because there is no consistent story that Putin is telling people. He starts off saying that we have to, defend the integrity of the Donetsk and the Lugansk People's Republics. Then there has been a CIA-sponsored Ukrainian Nazi coup at Kiev. We have to rescue our Russian-speaking Ukrainian brothers from the, American-sponsored Ukrainian Nazis. Then we have to restore the lands of Peter the Great. Then NATO is plotting an attack on Russia, so this is a preemptive attack on NATO. Then suddenly we find out that it's not Nazis, but Satanists that are in power in Kiev, and the true Christians need to defend from the Satanists. So, I mean, it's one crazy story after another, and there's no consistency to it. But somehow this is a population that's been broken. I mean, my Ukrainian writer friend Volodymyr Rafaenko describes this as the anthropological catastrophe of Russia. I mean, something has gone very, very wrong. It's these, the soldiers that are fighting, that are being slaughtering other people, being slaughtered themselves. They're not having a good time. I mean, I've also been trying to connect the relationship between nihilism and sadism. I mean, I know several people, quite well who have been tortured in Russian captivity. And, that to me is the edge of what I am trying to get my mind around. Like, what would ever cause one human being to do that to another human being? What is going on in their minds? How are they justifying it? Is there an ideology? Have they been broken? Is it this kind of nihilistic abyss? Is it this kind of performative sadism that is its own kind of erotic fascination? Is it, I mean, this to me is the edge of what I'm able to understand, but it's clearly quite central to what's going on there. And there's not, that cannot, realpolitik cannot explain that, which is one of the reasons I'm very skeptical about any possibility of negotiations and people thinking like, well, we're just playing a chess match. And if we have the pieces aligned the right way, we can play this game with Putin. No, if you are going to consider, the Kremlin's actions rational, you need to expand your definition of rationality until it is so capacious as to be effectively meaningless.
We'll come back to that because the idea of rationality and normalization, I think, puts us in a very weak position vis-a-vis populists and vis-a-vis authoritarians. But we'll come back to that. I think this is an interesting idea. I mean, having watched one of the Rest is History podcasts recently, they were talking about a really dark topic, which was idealism in Nazism, which we don't really want to open that box up because it's fairly vile given what happened. But they examined, what did people believe? Did they think they were the baddies, or did they think they were actually doing good for their people and the world? I think that's very disturbing. And we could ask that question about Russians. What do they think they are doing in this? We see it as inflicting chaos. We see it as increasing the sum total of human misery. I rather suspect, from listening to many sort of conversations on the channels I mentioned, plus 1420, which is an interesting channel that does sort of vox pops in Russians. I think many of them, the ones that are not citing the sort of genocidal propaganda, will perhaps see this as returning to order or a sense of order and security, because their sense of order and security is in a completely hierarchical system. where you know where you fit in. And that hierarchy can be enforced by violence, it can be enforced by humiliation, but it's a form of order. And I suspect they see Ukrainians as breaking that order, as getting away from it, and resenting them for that freedom, but also looking at it as a sort of incomprehension. No, order needs to be reimposed here.
There's certainly an element of that. I mean, and certainly what about Ukraine that one assumes was so threatening to Putin is that, these were other people, who were in this post-Soviet place struggling against kleptocratic oligarchy, who were largely Russian speaking, even if not monolingually Russian speaking. And yet, they were able to claim a sense of their own subjectivity, and carry out a revolution. And that, I mean, clearly the Maidan was enormously threatening, to Russia. And it was something, for which, the Russian intellectuals and oppositionists I know were very jealous, jealous in the sense of like they did, the Ukrainians did in 2013, 2014, what we had desperately wanted to do in Bolotnaya in 2011 and 2012, and we weren't able to pull it off. We weren't quite able to reach that tipping point. We weren't able to get the critical mass. We weren't able to get that number of people at the right time to cross to the other side of fear, and they were able to do it in Kiev. One of my Russian colleagues, said shortly afterwards, he's like, "Мы все смотрели на Майдан с восторгом." We were all looking at the Maidan ecstatically, and a sense of that, like generously, but also jealously, in the sense that that's what we want to do, and we're not able to pull it off in Russia, and precisely that feeling, it is of course what, Putin had in the antithetical way, which is that this is clearly a threat. I mean, and if you put this in Hegelian terms, I mean, the master-slave dialectic is that, it is the colonized. Subjectivity has emerged here on behalf of the colonized and not the colonizer. If we consider Russia the colonizer and we look at it from a traditional imperialist framework, which is, one of various frameworks we can use that I think has both its uses and limitations, there is the Russian master has not come to its own sense of subjectivity. I mean, this is what Hegel talks about in the dialectic with the slave, that the master is actually dependent on the recognition of the slave for his own subjectivity. There is a crisis of subjectivity in Russia. Why are these people, selling themselves, for different amounts of money? And there are billboards out in Moscow, saying like, come join the army, and we will pay you X. This is the price for human life in Moscow. Apparently, the price outside of Moscow is somewhat less, as one might expect. But under what conditions can you create a population that is willing to do that, that is willing to be sent out like cannon fodder, and or is willing to pretend it's all not happening as they go about their ordinary daily lives? Which I have to say is something that not only Russians do, but I mean, you see this in my own country as well. The capacity of people to look away from horror and go about their normal daily lives until the very end is quite extraordinary.
And this is where there's an interesting commonality, which I think will upset a lot of people. But part of the reason I think why Russians behave as they do is, Ukrainians don't show, подчинение. They don't подчинить to the Tsar. They don't
Mm.
show due deference to the not just the hierarchy, but to the sort of the Godhead figure, the semi-divine Tsar who is infallible at the top of this pyramid, despite all evidence of his fallibility. That nonetheless, and I always thought of this as being a distinctly Russian thing, but we see this same attitude, I would say, in some of MAGA. No
Yeah.
argument, no rationality, no dialogue is possible because you're coming up against is almost a sort of cult in
Yes.
immunity, that you're threatening the very identity. You're threatening someone who's thinking in terms of emotions, not rationality, and therefore almost no dialogue is possible. So there seems to me some commonality there.
There's a lot of commonalities there, and I suspect that Trump has learned a lot from Putin. There's also a common theme of ritual humiliation, and performative sadism that has become more and more apparent. I mean, it's one of the things I've been preoccupied with, as I listen to the stories of some friends of mine who have been in Russian captivity. this, this use of torture, not only to break people and not even to get specific information. I mean, they don't really need any information, but this sense of ritual humiliation to turn people into objects, to use violence, to turn people into objects, to utterly crush them, to show their superiority of them. And this was, I mean, as a historian, this strikes me, of course, because this ritual humiliation was also something you saw in performative self-criticisms during the Stalinist period, in the fact that victims of Stalinist purges had to thank the party for bestowing upon them their just punishment. This is what the women accused of being witches in the early modern period had to, thank the people leading them to the stake. Yeah, that the Oval Office scene where Vance is screaming at Zelensky saying, "You must say thank you." I mean, this was a trope of ritual humiliation. And now you have more recently, and in an exclusively American context, in some sense, Pete Hegseth spends millions, if not billions of dollars to fly American military leadership from all over the world back to Washington, put them all in one room, creating a huge security risk, expending an enormous amount of research sources to fat shame them. To say,
That's
you
it.
guys, you fatsos, you beardos, like, you're ugly, you're unkempt, you're gaining weight. And what does one even do with that? I mean, clearly this is a way that Trump relates to people. He enjoys humiliating people. Like that's the mode that he has of relating to people. And so I'm trying to also to connect that. I mean, one of the things that the White House official Twitter account sent out at a certain point was a Twitter message with a video clip of immigrants being chained up so they could be deported to these prisons on these deportation flights. And it was a video clip with close-ups of the chains on their legs so they could barely walk. And that with an emphasis on the sound of the chains rattling. And the White House sent this out with the title ASMR. And my 13-year-old daughter had to explain to me that ASMR was this Instagram genre of pleasurable sounds, potentially erotic sounds that, people use to calm them down or to go to sleep or just for enjoyment. And I thought this is sick. I mean, this is both ritual. It's not only have you taken these people with no due process as prisoners, but you're both humiliating them and then you're gleefully enjoying the sadistic dimensions of that. Yeah, I think okay, something has gone very, very wrong.
And
I
there's
don't
other
know
people
how
who
to get out of
rationalize
this.
it. I mean, I know people, and I won't name any names, who'll be like, well, no, the optics are bad, right? And yeah, you've seen some videos of people being dragged out of cars and babies snatched from people's hands. And yeah, some of them turned out to be American citizens in the end. But you can't make an omelet without cracking eggs is their argument. They'll
Yeah.
use rational policy objectives to almost skirt over like, well, this is, same with Doge. It's like, okay, so it didn't go exactly according to plan, but in principle, there's some rationality behind it. Whereas what you're talking about is something way beyond rationality,
Yeah.
which is a process of humiliation to reinforce a kind of hierarchy, and the hierarchy always serves the interests of a small number of people, an oligarchic elite.
No, I think that's it. And I don't think political science is really capable of explaining to us, precisely where all this is coming from. I think to some extent we've got to go back to Freudian categories, like what is drawing people to this? I mean, and what does it mean that ICE comes into an apartment building in Chicago in the middle of the night, and drags naked kids out of bed, and ties them up outside? Like how before, like right in front of the eyes of Americans, this is not a secret. This is not hidden, and in some sense, the fact that it's not hidden, is the point. The Russian American anthropologist Natalia Rudakova calls this cynical disinhibition when she was describing Putin's rise to power. that that was part of the thing itself, that you don't hide it. When that submarine sank on his watch and he declined to in any way mobilize to try to save the suffocating men on that submarine, and then there was what was it? Was it a CNN interview, maybe with Larry King, who asked him about what happened to the submarine. And Putin is just there smiling with a
He's
smirk saying, well,
smirking.
it
Yeah, it's a
sank.
vicious smirk, isn't he? It
Yeah,
sank,
no,
you know.
it's this enjoyment, this, you're actually taking pleasure in other people's suffering. And Trump has this whole genre now of the AI generated videos. I mean, his Trump Gaza video, like your AI generated fa beach casino fantasy of ethnic cleansing. We've got the AI generated Grim Reaper fantasy of, announcing the deaths of the Democrats. Like,
Then there's
I,
the plane literally wearing a crown and defecating on
yes.
crowds, which is he's telling you what he thinks. It's right there in plain sight.
No, it's not hidden. It's not hidden. It's right in our face, and that's part of the point. And I think that's one thing that the opposition has been really slow to figure out how that changes the game. We all spent, I mean, I wasn't doing anything actively, emotional energy, let's say, during the first Trump administration, waiting for the Mueller report, hoping that the thing that was hidden that would be exposed would then bring it all down. And I think that was a mistake, not in the sense that the issue is not what remains hidden. I'm sure there are details that remain hidden, but they can't be significant because basically all of this revolting violence and brutality and lawlessness is thrown in our face every single day. So the issue is not what is concealed. The issue is what we're able to normalize. The issue is our inability to grasp in real time what is happening right in front of us.
And I see Trump, having a career in marketing, I see him as almost an authoritarian marketeer. He is constantly probing and testing the boundaries of his impunity. Um,
Yeah.
in that respect, the demolition of the White House is being treated, it seems to me, on both sides in a misunderstanding of what's taking place here. He is quite literally defecating on American history and culture. Um, but it is a gesture. It isn't simply that building a huge ballroom in his honor. I mean that's obvious. But actually ripping down something is testing the impunity. It's almost a challenge to say,
Yeah.
well, okay, what are you going to do about it? I have literally defecated on something you value. It's not just a pile of bricks and paint and windows to him. He knows it had intrinsic value, and it's a gesture, it seems to me.
Yes, it's all performative. And it really is this Nero-like narcissism, and in this the the announcement of impunity is the thing itself. And the fact that we have let him get away with this, it is just terrifying that it's happened step by step by step, right in front of our face. We don't seem to, I mean, sometimes I get this feeling like both, in America, and in Europe that everybody is sleepwalking. And there's a feeling like I think one of the reasons why, despite the fact that I'm a cowardly person and, it's a bit stressful to go in and out of Ukraine these days, one of the reasons I feel so much better when I'm in Ukraine is that I feel like I'm in a place where people are not sleepwalking. And you can feel the thinking going on around you. Now, I, of course, am very privileged, to have to have friends in Ukraine who are writers and philosophers and so I'm surrounded by the most interesting people when I'm there. But I still, you feel like you're in this atmosphere where nobody is sleepwalking.
Yes, and they're also not, as someone pointed out, they're not coerced by Russia's nuclear threats. It's like, well, if they do it, do it, but that's not going to prevent us from
Yeah.
fighting back and doing what we must. I mean, that reminds me yesterday, and this is a real trigger I wanted to bring up with you. I had, you know, incredible Ukrainians on a stage at an event which I attended, including Olga Rudnieva of Superhumans and several others. Um, and then a very senior analyst, who will remain unnamed, at the end of the event said, "Oh, well, this is great, blah blah blah," and said, "But of course," and when someone says "of course," you know something's coming that you're going to fervently disagree with. At least I have that feeling. He said, of course, all wars end in some form of negotiation, and to achieve a durable peace, Ukraine's going to have to make concessions. I mean, that's just at that point, I had to stop myself from, jumping up out of my seat and shouting, because that would have been unseemly. But it seems to me there's several concepts here that talk to this normalization. The normalization of abnormal times, politics as abnormal, and this sleepwalking. One, the idea of anything durable with Russia. Is that a misconception, given that Putin has never really held any store in pieces of paper, treaties, etc. Then there's the genocidal impulse that we discussed earlier, but also as an authoritarian, it seems that Putin and indeed Trump will push through all the limits that we would posit as rational limits, whether it's economically rational, politically rational. They know that us in our rationality are going to cave before they do, because we can't imagine them going beyond certain self-imagined limits. And that seemed to me this is what this analyst was doing yesterday. Whereas every Ukrainian on the stage was like, no, no, there's no limit here to the lives he'll waste or the steps he'll take. It's just our failure to actually imagine that that could happen.
That's my intuition as well. I'm not an expert on political negotiations or international relations. I'm a historian. But as a historian, my strong intuition is that this is not a negotiation situation. The negotiation situation is always assuming, that the other person is going to act rationally. It's assuming the model of a chess tournament, where you're one grandmaster playing with another grandmaster, and you can foresee what would make sense. You assume that there are certain kinds of objective interest, that can be exchanged. I just don't think Putin has ever given us a reason to believe that this is the model we're working with. He is destroying his country. He is bleeding through his population. He is burning through their resources. A year and a half ago when I was in Kiev, there was one morning where just between 3 and 6 in the morning, the Kremlin sent like 31 cruise and ballistic missiles just to Kiev, and in a particularly concentrated period. And I happened to be there then. The Ukrainians experienced all this time, but because I happened to be there and I spent those hours in the bomb shelter, when I came out of the bomb shelter, I then asked a European diplomat friend. I said, just out of curiosity, how much did those 31 missiles cost? And that was $390 million worth of missiles. In a country where millions of people do not have indoor plumbing. I mean, this is not rational. I mean, what's going on is not, there are not rational interests here. We're looking into the mind of a madman. And so I don't believe that any kind of negotiation is possible, because I don't see any reason why one would then believe he would stop or not decide to do something else. I mean, I really feel like we're in much more of a kind of 1943 situation where, like, we could not have conceived of, you know, a, of a negotiation with Nazi Germany in which some part of the European population, including the European Jewish population, remained under Nazi rule. Like, we can't imagine that now because it would not have been sustainable. Like, that regime had to be completely, utterly defeated. There had to be a Stunde Null. You had to start over. And I think we're in that situation now. I think we need a Stunde Null. I think the idea of leaving some part of the population under under a reign of terror, I don't see that as morally sustainable. I mean,
And
I
that's
don't
the
like.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's my intuition. Again, I'm not an expert in negotiations, but I just don't think that can work. I think the Russian regime has to be completely and utterly defeated, and we need a total restart.
I think so, because something I read yesterday as a result of this event was basically saying that we get confused because Russia will not erase every single Ukrainian, because they don't necessarily see Ukrainians as necessarily non-human. They only see it if a Ukrainian insists on being a Ukrainian. If they're willing to eject that identity and be Russian, bend back to sort of Pachinit, then they can be human once more. And so it seems that it's a curious kind of genocide. It's a genocide of identity, not necessarily a racial genocide. This genocidal character of the war seems to actually confuse or doesn't quite fit with our definitions of. Same with the Russian Empire. It doesn't fit quite with our definitions of overseas empires based on a concept of race or racism, as I would argue. As an internal continental empire, it seems to have slightly different mechanics that just mean that we fail to sort of categorize it and respond accordingly.
I mean, all of these categories that we use, be they imperialism, colonialism, fascism, authoritarianism, genocide, concentration camps, these are all mediating devices that we use in order to mediate between the singular and the universal. No two historical situations are ever going to be exactly alike. I mean, it's a little bit like Kant, when Kant says that concepts without intuitions are empty and intuitions without concepts are blind. He says we need certain kinds of categories and concepts in order to process the irreducibly particular data, that we are given. And so I always feel that we should let ourselves use these because it's essential to thinking, but with a grain of salt, understanding that every situation is going to be a little bit different, and so there are elements here, of fascism in a 20th century sense. There are elements that are new, that are kind of postmodern. There are elements of kind of classical imperialism and colonialism, but with new and different twist. Um, I'm a little bit skeptical about the usefulness of the category of genocide because I feel like it distracts people from actually looking at atrocity as atrocity, and gets people caught up in a legal argument about intentionality in the minds of the perpetrators that I feel like paradoxically often has the effect of blunting our vision to the horror, as opposed to actually intensifying it. But again, I'm not a legal scholar, so I work with intellectual history, so it's a different perspective. Um, sorry, I now
This
forgot
con
the I forgot the original
Oh, that's
question.
no,
Yes.
I think it was more or less answered there. So these concepts they were designed to allow us to take action. And obviously, after the Second World War, genocide was a useful concept in order to help inform, let's say, the Nuremberg trials and these kind of things and create a sense of justice. Now it seems that some of these terms are almost an impediment to action. And we can also see this happening with the asset seizure, which is just mired in various legalistic arguments. Whereas at its face, I mean, the way see this, I know the way many Ukrainians will see it, is that here's a bunch of Russian money, which they accidentally left in Europe. They're not expecting it back. But the fact that we've got it and won't use it provides an extraordinary instrument for coercive control, which we have given them. But also, it shows very much weakness, which Russia is seeing, because as long as we don't use these assets to defend ourselves through the instrument of Ukraine, we are demonstrating to Russia that we do not have any sense of the existential threat or willingness to act on our own self-preservation. Thereby, we're actually inviting the next stage of aggression.
I find it, again, this is not my field of expertise, but I find it just mystifying that we're not using those assets. You know, the idea that, okay, there's international law and the international law, governs the seizure of assets and governs finances, but there is also international law about human rights, about which we've totally given up. I mean, the fact that Russia has a veto on the Security Council, that Iran gets to, chair various kinds of human rights committees, that the international community has proven totally impotent, in protecting anyone, anywhere at all. And yet suddenly, like, we're unable to protect people. We've given up on protecting people. The UN has become a symbol of its own impotence. And yet, when it comes to protecting financial assets, suddenly we become, very principled and legalistic. I don't understand why money should have this priority over human beings.
And using historical argument, again, it seems that there is a certain sort of rationality which in normal times is actually rather sensible. In abnormal times, it prevents our action. The parallels seem to be sort of there, it seems to me, in Hitler's expansion. I know everyone says you failed the argument if you bring Hitler up, but I think it is useful because he progressively took steps towards remilitarizing, the Rhineland. He took step after step, and at each step he doubted the ability to win if he was challenged. And at each step he was not challenged. He found he had impunity to go to the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and then obviously the Anschluss, and then Czechoslovakia, etc. It seems to me that Putin is on, as you say, history echoes rather than being a facsimile copy. But he's had a series of steps of impunity, and he's got a green signal to sail on through to the next stage. He may not know what that next stage is, but from many Ukrainians and even from the mouths of his own propagandists, it does seem that the ultimate goal is not Ukraine. In itself, that's a stepping stone to the destruction of the EU and NATO, not just as institutions, but as barriers to his ambition and the desire to create a new world, dare I say, disorder, not based on these principles of collective defense and rule of law.
And that's also my intuition. I don't think Putin would stop at Ukraine. Um, I again, I don't think we're an irrational actor kind of model, and I don't think he would stop at Ukraine. And I think the fact that he has this nuclear saber to rattle, is not a reason why he should be appeased, but it's a reason why he needs to be completely defeated. Otherwise the whole world is just captive to being held under these threats.
The same idea, and again, I'm not going to compare Trump to Hitler, etc. I don't think he's motivated at all by the same things as either, those ideologues in Germany, or indeed by Putin. I think he's got different things that he sort of values as end goals, but at the same time, there's a series of escalatory steps, each step sort of probing and trying. Where do you see the sort of the Trumpian expansion of, let's say, illegality and impunity going, based on your understanding of history?
Yeah, I mean this is something that as a historian, the pattern of step by step by step. There was a famous speech that Toni Morrison gave at Howard University in 1995 where she talks people through this, that the final solution didn't happen overnight. It was step by step by step. And much more recently, the Austrian president, Alexander von der Bellen, at a commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz, said, Auschwitz ist nicht von Himmel gefallen. Auschwitz did not fall from the sky. And that's how things happen. The borders recede. The borders of what is possible, of what is conceivable recede. They start to slip. And the thing you thought was inconceivable one day, is the new normal a few months later, and people have not noticed it, because it happens gradually, and that I think is not Russia or America or Ukraine, I think that is the human condition. We normalize the abnormal. To a large extent, that is part of our resilience. That is what enables people to continue living in gruesome circumstances. That enables people to, get up and feed their children, and send them to school, or teach them at home, or, that we adjust to certain things. But it also, of course, carries the danger, and what is happening now in the United States, where guys in balaclavas and masks can show up and just take people away off the streets in the middle of the night with no due process, with no warrant, with no arrest warrant, with
Or
no
broad
no
daylight. I
probable
mean,
cause
which,
or
yeah.
broad daylight, like that they don't have to show their ID, they don't have to take off their mask. That would have been inconceivable a short time ago. And people get used to it. People get used to it rhetorically. They get this language of vulgarity and brutality and violence that Trump started to inject 10 years ago. Like you could already feel it happening at the level of language, that things that were not permissible to say aloud suddenly became permissible to say aloud, that you start suggesting things, and the borders start to slip. And he has the extent to which it has become, as you say, like a cult in the Republican Party. You know, I think 15 years ago, 10 years ago, most Americans, including Republicans, would have said there is no way the Republican Party would go along with something like this. And I think they would have honestly believed that. But what we see is that people start to get in line. They normalize the abnormal. They accept the unacceptable. That is the human condition. That is what happens most of the time. Hannah Arendt said somewhere, she said, in conditions of terror, most people will comply. But she says some will not, and that is the justification for the continued existence of human life on Earth, the fact that some will not, but most will.
I think obeying in advance is an incredibly powerful concept as well to try and interpret what's going on. And that includes the hollowing out of institutions because we're seeing the sort of, incredibly visible effect of that, people being snatched off the streets. But the first stage is almost the quiet coup behind closed doors, and that is to not destroy institutions, but to render them incapable, to hollow them out, become rubber stamps in the way the Duma was turned, very soon after Putin came to power. What is the process there in the US of, let's say, institutional attack and decline, and how far has this got? Because I'm going to give this video the title America is Down, i.e. dot 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 down but not out. But how far are we along from transitional authoritarianism to established authoritarianism?
I feel very far. But also that assumes there's some kind of magical line that you cross. And I don't think that's the case. I think we're always existing on this kind of continuum. The Supreme, the appointments on the Supreme Court have been particularly devastating. The bankruptcy of the Supreme Court has been particularly devastating, and the ruling on presidential immunity um, the summer before last year's election was particularly devastating. The appointments that Trump made during his first administration, the appointment of Brett Kavanaugh, I think those were particularly fatal moments. As the Supreme Court has traditionally been like the most important check on executive power. And once they issued that ruling of presidential immunity, we really lost that. And they have by and large been just kind of getting in line with this president. And the lower courts have not necessarily done that. And they have issued ruling after ruling saying you can't do this, you can't take this person away, you don't have probable cause, we have habeas corpus. And the president's office has largely been saying, okay, well, fuck you, we're not going to listen. And then it's a question of what's going to happen because this is unprecedented territory. If the courts say no and the executive refuses to listen, then there's a question of is someone going to use violence? And my fear is that we're headed towards civil war and that what this administration wants is to provoke a civil war. All of these sending troops, calling places war zones, but the preparation for violence. This also reminds me of Russia. This cultivation of a tolerance for violence, an expectation of violence, a sense that violence is simply a language in which people relate to one another. I like that I feel very strongly. And we always had a lot of everyday violence. We have, as you know, we have the largest per capita gun ownership rate in the world in the United States. And we know what Chekhov says about guns. Once the gun is on the stage, it has to go off by the end of the third act. We already have a lot of that violence. And now we have political violence and increasing incitement to political violence. And it's a heavily armed population. There's an attempt to use the military against what Trump is calling, the internal enemy, the enemy within. And so it's clear that that's where we're headed. And I feel like there was a lot of that in Russia too, this cultivation of what, one of my Russian-speaking sociologist friends calls the threshold of sensitivity, where you try to desensitize people, like systematically to violence through various means of pop culture and politics, so that they're no longer shocked and they're no longer horrified. And I feel like there's something to that. Like these Russian soldiers, they come into Ukraine, they're they're faced with these middle-aged women who speak their language and could be their mothers, and they're tying them to boards and torturing them with electric shocks. Now, where does that come from? Violence as simply like a means of relating to another human being, as if you have no other language to express yourself other than through violence. And I worry that this is what's happening in the States as well. I mean, the regularity of political assassinations is very interwar-esque. On the day of the first No Kings rally, you wake up to find out that, there were attempted assassinations on four Minnesota lawmakers. Two of them were actually killed. Like that kind of thing. Oh, and let's send out the National Guard. Let's send the Marines. Let's try to incite our own military to turn against our own people for no particular reason. When the state governors are saying, no, this is not true. We don't have a war going on here. We don't need this. We don't want this. We're not asking for this. And yet the president sends these people anyway.
And the last question, which sort of relates to this and makes a continuity between Russia. I mean, we saw that when Stalin, it took him a number of years to sort of take over the apparatus of the Communist Party and of course, bring the intelligence services to heel as well. Once that process of consolidation was complete, that then merged into the Second World War, which clouds things a bit. But it seems that once you have regime consolidation, then it turns outwards to try and export its values. And
Mm,
same with Putinism. It took him a long time actually
mm,
to create that sort of internal control. But at some point, I think he felt, well, here we go. Right, we're ready to take this global.
yeah.
And now with Trumpism, it seems to be happening at a lightning pace with sort of, the tech mogul support and Trump, plus compliant right-wingers in Britain. They're now trying to take the BBC down. Now, not a huge defender, let's say, especially in the context of their coverage of Ukraine, which I think has been fairly appalling. But as an institution, you can see the process that you need to take down institutions of trust if you want to then consolidate that power. And it seems to me that we're now seeing the export of this same authoritarian slide or an attempt to pull that off here.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And I think it's this idea that there are no limits, that everything is possible. And one of the most devastating things that's happened in the States has been the hollowing out of the Center for Disease Control, which was a crucial institution for public health. Now we have measles outbreaks. Now we have, this whole crazy anti-vaccination thing. The fact that there's no longer an institution that can be trusted to issue recommendations on public health, policies on public health, the complete purging of all the actual legitimate medical experts, in that institution, has been like, as a parent, I find this one of the most terrifying things. As I was talking to my father, who's a retired internist, and is the son of an internist from a previous generation. And he said, my dad's generation, they really knew how to treat measles because it was pre-vaccination. And my generation already had very little experience treating measles because they had been eliminated because of vaccinations. And so now when they come back, we're in a particularly vulnerable position because we don't have people with experience treating them. And the idea that you're you're leaving your children, out to the wolves, is completely horrifying. And I don't see any reason why this wouldn't be exported. I mean, Trump decides that windmills are ugly, that, that global warming is a hoax, that other people also shouldn't shift to clean energy, that maybe we should invade Greenland. I mean, suddenly there's great enthusiasm for taking over Greenland. I suspect by precisely the same 25% of the population who 6 months earlier had no idea there was such a place as Greenland. Maybe we should make Canada the 51st state. Maybe we should. I think we're in this world where for both Putin and Trump, we're both looking into a moral abyss. There are no values, there are no first principles, and there is no sense of limitation. It really is a Dostoevskian attitude in which, everything is permissible. Все позволено. Like these men don't feel like they are living under any kind of constraints at all. Now, somebody, may just have that problem, but the fact that the world has allowed them to actually act on it is the terrifying thing. The way in which Trump's cabinet meetings now go, where people just pay homage. I mean, it really is like Nero-esque. I mean, some of it is reminiscent of, things they would say about Ceausescu in the 1980s, the genius of the Carpathians, the king of the Danube. But it's completely crazy. But nobody
Putin's
is
court as
stopping them.
well. I mean, Putin's court has always functioned in that ritual humiliation process as well.
Yes. Yes, no, no, that combination of this crazy indulgence of narcissism and ritual humiliation and performative sadism and moral nihilism. I mean, it really is a dire moment. I realize I'm describing this and I'm not offering any solutions, but maybe you will
We'll
have.
come to the solution in the next episode and the immunity to authoritarianism, but I think we'll need to think quite hard about that. I mean, for this episode, I'm so glad we ended up in the place where we sort of started, and I think that has a sort of a consistency there and a reminder to people about what we started talking about in the episode. But I'm massively grateful to you for coming on, and of course for all the work you and your colleagues do to try and push back against this authoritarian tendency. Marci, thank you so much for coming back on.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Jonathan.